The countdown is on. In less than 72 hours, the U.S. will hold its general election, which will determine who becomes the 47th president of the United States. Pollsters say it is too close to call and could swing either way. A Kamala Harris or Donald Trump presidency just a hair's breadth away. The candidates have been on the campaign trail with the state of the economy, immigration, abortion, and even the war in the Middle East proving points of contention. The question then becomes whose vision of America will carry the day, the conservatives or the liberals? Neck and neck. Polls released on the U.S. presidential election, due to be held on Tuesday, the 5th of November, a mere 3 days away, show razor-thin margins between the leading candidates. Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic flag bearer, and Donald Trump, the Republican Party candidate. This poll, published by the New York Times on Saturday, shows Harris to be a mere percentage point ahead of Trump nationally, while this poll, published by Atlas Intel on Thursday, shows Trump ahead of Kamala nationally by less than 2 percentage points. While the general election is traditionally held on the first Tuesday of November every 4 years, already more than 50 million ballots have been cast in early voting, with 160 million registered to vote. But securing the popular vote is not a guarantee of winning the presidential election, as was the case with Hillary Clinton, who won the popular vote by 2.9 million against Donald Trump in 2016. It comes down to the 538 votes of the Electoral College, a system intended to balance power between the big and small states. 50 make up the United States. States with more people are represented by more Electoral College votes. The candidate who wins the majority vote in a state wins their Electoral College vote. A presidential candidate requires 270 or more Electoral College votes, more than half of the 538 up for grabs. Some states are, however, known as blue states, and others are red states on account of their voting history. The swing states are therefore the most contested. These are Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Arizona, where it could go either way. All right, as I mentioned earlier, we are joined virtually by Joanna LeBlanc, who is not only a national security expert, but a legal expert as well as a foreign relations expert. We're also joined from New York by Professor David Monda, who is a political scientist. And with me in studio, we have Dr. Bob Wekesa, African Center for the Study of the United States, based in the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Joanna, I will start with you. Several issues have been at the fore of this election. Those who support Trump say the election was performing better when he was in office. There's a question of immigration. The Republicans have accused the Democrats of being bleeding hearts. The state of global security is in question with the war in the Middle East, and we still have the Ukraine and Russia situation. What, in your view, will be the determining factor in this election?
As you said earlier, again, thank you so much for having me on. As you said earlier, it is quite too early to call. But what's interesting here is that for the first time in American history since the Vietnam War, we have a foreign policy issue that could impact the outcome of this election. For example, you look at the state of Michigan, where you have a great deal of undecided voters because of their discontent with how the administration is handling the crisis in the Middle East. And then also, too, so that's one issue. But secondly, the issue around immigration. Americans are concerned. Mr. Trump and the Republican Party have been very strong on putting out policy proposals that would address the immigration crisis. While some could argue that some of those policies are uncalled for, they're not strategic, they're not sound, because you're talking about if Mr. Trump were to be elected, he has committed to deport more than 1.5 million undocumented workers. And the reality is that for many sectors here in this country, especially your food sector, your very essential sectors, you have it's a huge number of immigrants who are doing those jobs that Americans otherwise would not do. So if Trump were to follow through with a policy where he deports illegal immigrants in mass numbers, you're going to see a rise in food costs in this country. Whereas with the Democratic Party, there is a conversation about, yes, we do have a crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. The immigration system is broken, but perhaps the Democratic Party should address the issue from a humane standpoint and from a standpoint that actually makes sense and that will move America forward, not backward.
All right, Professor David Monda, are the polls reliable? Is the race really that close?
Yeah, I definitely think the race is very, very close because the electorate through the Electoral College is also reflective of our Congress. So you find even in the U.S. Senate, it's almost split half and half. And in the U.S. House of Representatives, it's also split half and half. So I think the polls are accurate. The two polls you mentioned, the New York Times poll and the Atlas poll, were within the margin of error, so plus or minus 3% of the polling data. However, I must add that these polls and any poll in an election is really a picture of the electorate at that moment in time. So today is Saturday here. A lot can change between Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. So polls may not always be reliable in terms of deciding who will actually win the election. What will be key will be within these 7 swing states, where you're thinking the Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia, Arizona, and North Carolina, who will be able to get their voters out in significant numbers in order to ensure that they're able to win these very key states. But we cannot rely completely on polls at this point.
All right. Dr. Wekesa, I'll bring you in at this point. Is this a battle for the soul of America between the conservatives and the liberals? The question of abortion and a woman's right to choose has been central where debate is concerned. The rights of those in the LGBTQ community. In your view, is that what this election will come down to?
No, thanks. And I think those are very crucial and key issues during these elections. Because to start with, in fact, for many Africans, speaking from the continent, my colleagues have spoken from across the Atlantic, it is, in fact, incomprehensible that we're even talking of a Trump, kind of big play in these elections, because we thought Trump was gone. We will have, Harris will sweep the stakes, as it were. But I think it tells you that some of the key issues that are the heart of America's, society and so forth are still at play. And this will include issues to do with religious, Christian, evangelical, strong sentiments that speak to LGBTQ rights, that speak to issues of anti-abortion rights and so forth. So I think, indeed, this conservative versus liberalism in the U.S. is going to be a major issue at play in these elections. We can't discount it. Yeah.
All right. Jonah, I'll bring you in at this point. We've seen Trump make statements where the continent is concerned, such as shithole countries, pardon my language. We've seen comedians at his rallies say Puerto Rico is an island of floating garbage, and yet it appears that Kamala is the one who has been put on the defensive. What are the Democrats not getting right?
Well, I think that one thing about the Republican Party is that they have a message and they stick to it, no matter what backlash that the Republican Party may receive, in particular Trump's party. Let's be honest, because there's a difference between the Republican Party and Trump's party. There's a huge difference. So I think that they're very strong on messaging, right? But what I also think is important is that, yes, while Mr. Trump may have called some of these countries a shithole, for, excuse my French, but the reality is that Trump is an isolationist when it comes to foreign policy, and he's a non-interventionist and also protectionist. So under a Trump presidency, what you will see in countries like across the African continent is you will see less sanctions. That's one. Secondly, you will see countries like Uganda that was removed from AGOA because of its recent passage of a LGBTQI plus legislation in the country. You will see Uganda being invited back to the program. So I think that while some of the rhetoric may be quite concerning, but what you hear on the ground is that under a Trump administration, African nations would deal with less sanctions. Now, will that materialize to perhaps more support for trade and investment? Some would argue maybe not, maybe yes. But what I will tell you is that under the Trump administration, he invested a great deal in Prosper Africa, which is an institution, an American organization, agency that promotes trade and investments on the African continent. And on top of it, Mr. Trump provided enormous financial support for the Development Finance Corporation, where investors could secure debt financing for their projects in emerging markets. So while Mr. Trump's rhetoric may not appeal to most people, it may be rather offensive, but there are some good that did happen under his administration when it comes to the African continent.
All right, I'll come to you, David. Now, how much is the generational factor going to be an issue in this election? And I ask that because the younger generations have taken particular exception to what is happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a generational gap, not only in terms of the voting constituency, particularly a lot of the younger college-educated voters are more sympathetic or liberal in terms of their leanings towards LGBTQI plus questions, and also in terms of of a woman's right to choose, right, in terms of reproductive freedoms. And I think that will be a factor. The challenge with younger voters is always getting them out to vote. So historically, statistically, the majority of voters generally tends to go up. The volume of voters generally tends to go up. The older, the demographic. So that will also be very interesting to think about in terms of this this element. But I must also add, you talked a little bit earlier about abortion and you talked about the young generation. This also has a direct impact, this election with Kenya, and Africa more broadly, where you find a lot of groups that are supporting Trump are also very much pro-life. So if Trump wins, we should anticipate a cutting of funds for a lot of U.S. agencies that promote abortion or reproductive rights in Africa. And I think that's a very challenging aspect in terms of a continent. And you also mentioned young voters. I think the Gen Z element in terms of Kenya and influencing Kenyan politics is also very much germane within Kamala Harris's constituency of voters. If she's able to win, and as you can see during the election, she's not emphasized so much that she's, her gender, she's emphasized her policy. She will really need to get those young voters out, and she will need to get those constituencies that emphasize the key elements that she wants to push for. And that's in terms of immigration, abortion, women's right to choose, which is very popular among women or most women in this country, but also on the questions on tariffs and trade. And I think that's another element that will tie Africa and Kenya. particularly when we're thinking about AGOA coming up for renewal with the U.S. Congress, but also in terms of the Nairobi Accord on climate change and how that impacts U.S. policy to Africa, but largely also the third element in terms of the security agreements between the U.S. and Africa. The U.S. is really trying to catch up with China, not only in terms of trade, but on security. And very recently, you saw the CIA chief visit with President Ruto. So these dynamics will be very interesting and will be very determinant in terms of the new person that will be elected and how Africa will interact with the U.S. Africa needs to ensure its agency. It cannot always be requesting and begging from the states. It needs to establish a one-on-one dialogue of a transaction that's beneficial to both sides.
All right. Dr. Wekesa, Joanna, in her opening remarks, talked about the impact of the U.S. foreign policy in this election. How much will what is happening in the Middle East, Israel and the Palestinians and Hamas and Hezbollah impact this election in your view?
No, I think to a great extent. In fact, actually, lots of people are talking of the potential for a third world war. Based on what's happening in terms of the Israeli invasion of Palestine and the extensive intrusion of Israel into the West Bank, which is now drawing in Iran, Iran being a major nuclear power in the Middle East, supportive of Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis, further afield, and really just a large power. I think we've had talk of, Iran also linking up potentially with China, but more directly with North Korea and Russia. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a major geopolitical problem for whoever becomes the next president, knowing that both Trump and Harris are almost aligned in their support for Israel, which is a traditional U.S. policy position. I think, in fact, now there's questions of double standards here, because whereas the U.S. has taken the position that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and that it's unjustifiable and morally not correct. In Israel and Palestine, it is very clear that Israel has caused quite a major atrocity in Palestine. I think the numbers, the last I counted, was over 50,000 deaths. Of course, the argument is that October 7th happened and they were provoked. No, but you see, you look at the level of response to... And in fact, if you look at the numbers now, the October 7th, 1,200 people dead. We are climbing towards 50,000 plus dead. A country flattened, only rubble. The ICJ, International Criminal Justice, has weighed into the matter, has called Israel to question. Israel has refused to even adhere to the provisions that have been made by a legal body. I think the ICC, International Criminal Justice Court, which we know here in Kenya because we are subject to that, President Uhuru, Deputy President, then Deputy President Uhuru Kenyatta, went through, Deputy President William Ruto. Went through that process. So we all know that process. Why isn't it that Benjamin Netanyahu is also subject to the same? Now, on these two issues, the president, Vice President Kamala Harris, and candidate Donald Trump are almost in agreement that they will support Israel to the hilt. Okay. Yet in Israel, in a Ukraine-Russia issue, we see them allying more with Ukraine than Russia. So you're saying this, this is double standards. No, but how will it impact Kamala's candidacy versus Trump? No, I think at this point in time, we are looking at the vote within the U.S. Okay. That is more inclined towards looking at a justifiable, balanced U.S. policy in the rest of the world.
Because there are those who argue that, Trump is a strong man. If he was in office, he argues this would not have happened. But just moving away from that, I want to bring the security closer home. The U.S. has been the biggest supporter of Kenya's intervention in Haiti. Joanna, how would a change of guard, a Trump presidency, impact that?
Well, while Mr. Trump is a non-interventionist, I argue that if an argument were to be made that maintaining this mission in Haiti serves in the strategic national security interest of the United States government, I think that Mr. Trump will continue to support the mission because one thing about the United States is that whenever an argument deals with national security interests of the country, usually the argument prevails. But it's going to be based upon the Kenyan government, the Haitian government, as well as some of the stakeholders here in Washington, the think tanks, members of Congress, even the State Department, to make an argument that if the security issue in Haiti continues to fail, it's going to open the door for bad actors like terrorist groups to come into the country and find their way to the shores of the United States of America. Listen, Olive, the reality is that Haiti has a population of about 12 million people. The Caribbean is known as the United States' third border. From Miami, Florida to Haiti, it's a 2-hour flight. So in terms of proximity, it is very, very close. And the situation in Haiti has gotten more dire. You're talking about more than 600,000 people have been displaced due to gang violence in the country. And I've said this on your show before. While I applaud the Ruto administration for taking the lead on helping to address some of the insecurity crisis in the country and hopefully help the country work towards free, fair, and inclusive elections next year, more and more countries, however, need to step up and provide additional financing for the mission to be truly successful. It is important. But again, as I said, in order for this mission to remain intact under a Trump presidency, an argument and evidence has to be shown that it is indeed in the strategic national security interest of the United States to do so.
All right. Monda, before I quickly ask for your predictions on which way you think this will go, although you can't really tell since 2016, Hillary won by 2.9 million votes, the popular vote. Only, I think it was the third or fourth time in history, and she lost at the Electoral College phase. But David, several things you raised, the issue of Kenya's climate change agenda, as well as jobs we are looking for in Silicon Valley. Should Kenya be paying particular attention to the outcome of this election?
I think Kenya definitely should. And piggybacking off of what Joanna was mentioning, because Kenya is now a non-NATO ally of the United States, what that means is Kenya has extra access not only to U.S. intelligence, but also to the Ukraine dialogue group, which is intimately involved with the war in Ukraine. And it also brings Kenya closer in terms of international geostrategic questions. So Kenya should definitely be looking out for these elections. We also, because we have Kenyan police in Haiti, about 400 right now, 600 more who are gonna go to Haiti. And then the other thing Kenyans should be thinking about is whether Kamala or Trump administration would change the security support mission in Haiti into a fully fledged UN peacekeeping mission. I think that's something that the Ruto administration needs to be very clear with Kenyans about. But I think lastly, I must add, Kamala Harris has the Partnership for Digital Access in Africa. She's been herself to Tanzania, to Ghana, and to Zambia. Trump has not. So there'll be opportunities on both sides, depending whether Trump wins or whether Kamala wins. Kamala will essentially be continuing on the Biden legacy, putting her own personal imprint. But Trump is not an ideologue. He's more of a transactional leader, very pragmatic. And I think if Trump wins, there's space there within our foreign policy frameworks to decide what will be beneficial for Kenya and in Kenya's broader African interests. And I think climate change, the Nairobi Accord was one very interesting element, but also this partnership to expand the digital space under Kamala Harris is another thing Kenya should be thinking about because of Kenya's emphasis to try and create this idea of the digital savannah, in Nairobi.
All right. I will spare you from having to make a prediction on whether it is a toss-up, too close to call, or whether Kamala is in the lead. Trump.
No, I can predict that. I'm hoping Kamala Harris wins. New York State will be voting for Kamala Harris. I think Africa, in my own opinion, would be better with a Kamala Harris administration, because the Democrats tend to have more of a multilateralist framework rather than the inward-looking ideas of Donald Trump, which I think will take us behind.
Anything you want to add to that, Joanna, before Dr. Wekesa closes?
It is too close to call, Olive, and I don't want to be wrong.
Okay. So, Dr. Wekesa, here we have one candidate who is a climate change denier, Donald Trump. And yet you have Kenya pushing for economic reform and saying that the sun, our carbon sinks, should be used should have monetary value on the global stage. So, in your view, should we be paying attention?
No, we must pay attention, but I'll start by saying, echoing my colleague, Professor Monda, in saying, indeed, Kamala Harris will be better for Kenya, for Africa, and for the rest of the world, because generally the Democratic Party and candidates thereof are progressive. They are more impressive of collective action on the global stage. Whereas a Trump administration will be isolationist, it will take us back to the 2017-2020 era when actually the Trump presidency at the point in time took us out of the Paris Climate Accord on climate change. During COVID, took us out of took the US out of the WHO and so forth. But having said that, I think I wanted to just build on what Professor Monda was saying, that for Kenya, they will need to be very strategic. One point that comes across very clearly is President Ruto visited the U.S. on a state visit only in May. By June, when the Jay-Z protest happened, the U.S. was already rethinking its relations with Kenya on the basis that it's not a very democratic state. And only yesterday, in fact, the ambassador here, Meg Whitman, was actually very critical of snooping on Kenyans via the mobile telephony and so forth. So it tells you that if Kenyans are not very careful about adherence to democratic ideals, observing of human rights principles and so forth, they cannot always count on being non-NATO allies of the U.S. or just taking it for granted that we had this state visit, we had a large number of agreements, and it's a given. It's not a given. And I think one of the other points one has to make is that we should not discount, if it is a Trump presidency, we should be ready for it. Remember in 2020, the Trump administration had an FTA, free trade agreement, with Kenya, even as the African Continental Free Trade Area was being rolled out.
Yeah.
So Kenya was very transactional because other African states were like, hey, Kenya is, sailing us out, going out on its own when we have this continental arrangement. And I think in fact, this is my closing remark. Kenyans need to go back to that very major statement that was made when President Ruto went to Washington, D.C. It's available on the White House
website,
webpage. It's very comprehensive. It's almost like 10 pages of agreements across digital technologies, university engagements, people-to-people, health, and so forth. And these do not have to be done by only governments. Some of them can actually be done by non-state actors and so forth. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. That is Dr. Bob Wekesa, African Center for the Study of the United States, based in the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. We've also had joining us from across the pond, Joanna LeBlanc, who is an expert not only in legal matters, but national security, as well as foreign relations. And we've had with us, joining us from New York, Professor David Monda, a political scientist. And he says his vote is for Kamala, as does Dr. Wekesa say. He says a Kamala presidency would be better for Kenya. We keep an eye on the elections, and depending on which way it goes, we will be asking the questions: do we need to recalibrate on jobs? Do we need to recalibrate on our push for economic reforms on the global stage? We take a break, but coming up on the other side.